You know how people say your best friend knows you better than anyone else? I used to believe that too. Jake and I had been inseparable since childhood. He was the guy who saw me through everything: first crushes, heartbreaks, family troubles, and embarrassing moments only we could laugh about. He wasn't just my best friend, he was like a brother. If there was one person I thought would always have my back, it was Jake. And then there was Sarah, my wife. We'd been together for 5 years, and honestly, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. She was beautiful, intelligent, and incredibly supportive. We were the couple people admired, the ones who seemed to have it all together. But life has a way of flipping things around when you least expect it. A few months ago, I started noticing changes in Sarah. She seemed distant, lost in her thoughts, conversations shorter, her laughter less frequent. There was this sadness in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. Every time I asked her about it, she brushed it off, claiming it was just stress from work. I wanted to believe her, but the unease gnawed at me. I turned to Jake for advice. We met up for beers and I poured my heart out, telling him how I felt like Sarah was slipping away. He listened, nodding at the right moments, but something was off. He seemed uncomfortable, almost anxious. It wasn't like him. Jake was usually the confident, easygoing type. But I dismissed it, thinking maybe he just felt bad for me. Despite my efforts, surprise date nights, weekend getaways, heartfelt conversations, the distance between Sarah and me only grew. I convinced myself it was just a rough patch, something we'd work through. Then, one evening, Sarah said she was going to a friend's house. I didn't think much of it at first. But when midnight rolled around and she still wasn't home, I started to worry. Her phone went straight to voicemail and my texts went unanswered. Out of desperation, I messaged Jake, asking if he'd heard from her. He didn't reply either. The next day, Sarah was back to her cheerful self, acting like nothing had happened. She laughed, shared stories, and even initiated affection. For a moment, I let my guard down, hoping we'd turned a corner. But the unease never left me. I started noticing little things, how she'd smile at her phone, how she always seemed to have somewhere to be. The nagging feeling in my gut grew stronger until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers, so one evening while she was in the shower, I checked her phone. What I found shattered me. Her messages with Jake were subtle, careful not to be explicit, but the flirtatious undertone was unmistakable. They reminisced about that night and made plans to meet again. My stomach twisted as I realized the truth. Jake, my best friend, and Sarah, my wife, had been betraying me behind my back. I didn't confront them right away. I wanted to catch them in the act, to make them face the weight of what they'd done. So I pretended nothing was wrong, even though the thought of them together consumed me. A week later, Sarah told me she was visiting her sister. I knew exactly what that meant. After she left, I waited a few minutes before getting in my car and following her. She pulled into a hotel parking lot, and a few minutes later, Jake showed up. I watched them walk inside together, and it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I waited until they checked in, then followed them to their room. My hands shook as I knocked on the door. When they opened it, their faces were a mix of guilt and shock. They stammered, tripping over excuses and apologies, but I didn't want to hear it. There were no words that could undo what they'd done. I left them there, unable to bear their presence any longer. That night, I went home, packed my things, and left. There was nothing more to say. Their actions had spoken louder than any apology ever could. It's been months now. The pain has dulled, but the scars remain. Losing them felt like losing pieces of myself, but I've come to realize it was necessary. They'd taken enough from me, and I wasn't about to let them take any more. Now I'm focusing on my self-rebuilding, healing, and learning to trust again. It's a slow process, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally moving forward.